My name is Charles Paxson from the University of St Andrews, and I'm talking about the changing reality of sea monsters in the 19th century. To understand that changing reality, you've really got to appreciate the cartoon which you see in front of you from August 1935, which shows Mussolini as a sea serpent and Haile Selassie of Ethiopia as a giant gooseberry. And implicit in the cartoon, the context of which would be recognised by anybody, a regular British reader of newspapers until about the 1950s, was that both the giant gooseberry and the sea serpent were indicative of the silly season. And what was the silly season? Well, the silly season was the time when Parliament is no longer sitting and the gay world is no longer gathered in London. Ecclesiastical reformers pressed the claims of Mr. Slope to the deanery of Barchester, and enthusiastic antiquaries rummaged the ruins of Carthage in the hopes of finding the bones of Hannibal. In short, it was the time of the parliamentary recess, either in late summer, early autumn, or in January and February, where newspapers were short on news, and so they had to try and fill it up in some way. And there was a perception that it was filled up with silly stories of giant gooseberries, reigns of frogs, and above all, the sea serpent. This idea was widely propagated. So, for example, in Rudyard Kipling's short story A Matter of Fact in 1892, he tells a tale of three journalists who see two sea monsters en route to the UK, but realise they can never publish the story as no one will ever believe them. You can see that he quotes the giant gooseberry and the raining frogs. But in fact, Kipling was wrong, because in 1892 there were plenty of newspaper stories about people seeing sea serpents, and whilst people were sceptical, there was still a large body of opinion that was open-minded as to the attitude, as to their view on sea serpents. Now, skepticism about sea serpents in some ways is quite unusual and strange in the 19th century, because there was good reason to think that sea serpents might actually exist. The first reason is an obvious one: people reported them. Here you see some results of a database I've been compiling for the last few years of sea monster reports. Now, you should be a bit wary of interpreting this, because partially it reflects my diligence in looking for reports rather than actual temporal trends, but you do see some interesting patterns. We see lots of sightings from around about 1820. We see another load of sightings from the 1930s. That's associated with the worldwide publicity associated with the Loch Ness Monster. And then we also see a general uniform distribution of sea serpent reports throughout the 19th century, apart from a little blip, which, to be honest, I can't fully explain, round about 1860. For some reason, there seem to be fewer reports around about 1860. Well, there may be a reason for that. What were the reports like? Well, they could be like this one from 1817 to 1820, all about a sea serpent that was seen off the coast of Massachusetts in 1817 to 1820. Or a bit later, you could perhaps consider this one, another one with a coastline. I wanted to make it literal. Off the coast of Brazil, where a sea serpent was seen to be trying to strangle a sperm whale. So people were reporting sea serpents. So that was one line of evidence. Secondly, people were discovering new species of giant marine animal in the 19th century. So the graph on the left is a graph of the number of species described per year since 1758, the 10th edition of the Systema Naturae by Linnaeus. Now, he listed a lot of species, but they were a backlog. So you can ignore that spite. But you can see that, especially in the early part of the 19th century, there were lots and lots of new species being described. You can also see from the graph on the right-hand side that the rate at which things were being described was far greater in the middle part of the 19th century than it was before or after. So this graph has got time on the x-axis and it's got the cumulative number of species described on the y-axis. So it's the sum totals that you see from the left-hand graph. So in that middle part of the 19th century, people are reporting lots and lots of new species of animal. Not only that, since the 1790s, people had been describing new species of extinct reptile from what was known as the secondary era, which were species which could be potential basis for the sea serpent. So we've got the fact there are unknown animals. There was eyewitness testimony. We had skeletons of ostensibly extinct animals, which could be a basis for the sea serpent. So why not believe in sea serpents? Well, people were sceptical. Oh yes, and also these new discoveries were being popularised. So here we have the famous prehistoric animals from Crystal Palace. So, well, the first question perhaps we should ask, or I would ask as a statistician, is actually did people become more sceptical about sea serpents in the middle part of the 19th century? I've been saying that they were, but I haven't really offered you any evidence that they became more sceptical. So I thought I'd better develop an index of scepticism in sea serpents and to see if people were becoming more sceptical. And I thought, well, how can I do this? And I thought, well, one way might be to consider total occurrences of comments about the sea serpent, say from an influential newspaper like the Times, and consider what proportion of those through time were negative. So I did that, and so I broke up time into 5-year chunks, and I looked at all of the references to the Times in the period from 1800 to 1900, and looked to see whether their references to sea serpents were negative or positive or neutral. And I then plotted here the proportion of reports, the comments, which appear to be negative. And it seems fairly clear that they go up in 1840 and are kind of at a slightly higher level than they were in the first half of the 19th century. But I wasn't entirely convinced by that, partially because the point from in just after 1840, where the people are very, very sceptical, was based on only one reference to sea serpents in the Times. So I thought I'd better add some extra data to it. So I then considered the Manchester Guardian, which was published for most of the 19th century. So if you add that to it, that's the red, and you can see that arguably perhaps there is an increase in scepticism about the sea serpent over the entire time period. And I thought, well, okay, I better look at another newspaper, maybe from Scotland, to give a sort of British full coverage. And that, again, perhaps indicates scepticism, although there's one lone point sitting there which didn't really link to any other time period, because accounts of sea serpents in the Aberdeen Press and Journal were quite rare in the first half of the 19th century. And then I thought, well, this is getting a bit confusing now, so what I should do is perhaps amalgamate all the data together and replot it. And if you do that, then it does genuinely see that the pattern we first saw in the Times does appear to be real, in the sense that there was an increase in scepticism about sea serpents in the 1840s, and that sort of continued thereafter. So something happened in the 1840s which made people more sceptical about sea serpents, perhaps. Well, certainly by the late 1840s, people were starting to suggest alternative explanations for sea serpents in a way in which they hadn't done perhaps so much in the past. So here we have an image of the sea serpent seen by HMS Pumper in 1849, and shortly after that account was published, the Punch Humour magazine suggested that an alternative explanation for the Pumper sea serpent, that it was in fact some sort of boat just floating in the open sea, which was mistaken for a sea serpent. And so people were starting to suggest these alternative explanations. But why were they starting to suggest these alternative explanations? And that's the bit I'm still not 100% sure about. I can only point to one particular event which might have spread the idea of scepticism about sea serpents. And that was a letter that was written to the Times in 1848 by Sir Richard Owen, the founder of the Natural History Museum, coiner of the word dinosaurs, and sea serpent skeptic. And in response to an account of the sea serpents seen by the captain and crew of HMS Daedalus en route to St. Helena in the autumn of 1848, Owen said that their suggestion it was a sea serpent was probably incorrect. And he said, well, whilst he was open to reasonable proof or evidence of existence, he said that the sightings generally didn't look like sea serpents, didn't actually look like serpents. People could overestimate size, and above all, there was a lack of material evidence for these species. If there was a carcass, if they existed, there occasionally would be carcasses. They'd be washed up, and people would describe them. A powerful argument at the end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century, but less powerful argument in the 19th century because, of course, there still were lots of new large marine species to be described. He also argued that, and again a strange argument in the 19th century, that all of the fossil reptiles that had been found were from the secondary era and none more recent had been found. A perfectly reasonable point in the 19th century, except, of course, no one quite knew how old the secondary era was, and so if it was only tens of thousands of years, would it be so strange to find that there could still be reptiles from the secondary era swimming in the seas of the 19th century? Well, for Owen, the lack of material evidence was compelling. So he said, finally, in summary, a larger body of evidence from eyewitnesses might be got together in proof of ghosts rather than the sea serpent. So that's the only material skeptical argument that had reasonable prominence really in the 1840s. So I wonder if the skepticism we see in the 1840s dates to that. My argument doesn't fully work, though, because the rise of skepticism actually occurs in the early 1840s, which is before his letter was actually written. So maybe there's something else going on which I still haven't quite worked out. So my conclusions are preliminary. They're biased, and they're very strongly British-centric. However, I do think it's fair to say that skepticism of sea serpents increased over the 19th century, with the pivotal point being in the period 1840 to 1850. That was despite eyewitness testimony and lots of relevant zoological and paleontological discoveries. Why? I'm still not sure, but it could be because of increasing reliance on material evidence. I'm not really sure all this is Gothic. It seems a bit lightweight and humorous to be Gothic, but it's not even literal because many of the sea serpent sightings are really on the high seas. But I hope you can tolerate that because I do mention monsters and I did mention ghosts and I did mention rains of frogs, all of which you can think of as being a little bit Gothic. Thank you very much.